Just imagine, it's 8 p.m. on a Saturday, you just got some brand new model kits, you go to turn on your compressor, and compressors used to be so bad that people would get CO2 tanks for soda machines so they could spray in peace. Things have gotten a lot better, but a lot of these compressors still suck, which is why I have 7 in my apartment, and today we're going to find out if any of these are any good. All compressors get hot, they need brakes. Even if they don't tell you, they all have some kind of a duty cycle. Generally speaking, I wouldn't want any of them to be running continuously for like 30-40 minutes. Having a tank helps a ton here. All compressors concentrate moisture in the air. It doesn't happen right away, it's something that builds up as you're painting. Without moisture traps, your airbrush can spit water straight into your paint job. Again, having a tank is extremely helpful here. It's basically a giant moisture trap. And of course, the marketed specs can be wildly misleading. Noise ratings are all over the place, but also airflow when pressure is not specified. There's a lot of variables when you're squeezing air, but basically as pressure builds up, it becomes more difficult, so airflow drops. So something like this one says 0.8 CFM, and then this one says 0.7 SCFM, standardized cubic feet per minute at 90 PSI, and this one is way more powerful. So I got a bunch of tests lined up. First, let's look at some compressors. So this is the TC40, and it's just the most basic standard airbrush compressor. It's got a motor spinning a piston, and it's pushing air through a little one-way valve. Then it goes through a regulator and a filter moisture trap, standard 1/8" airbrush hose from the regulator to your airbrush. Turn it on, and you'll notice it has auto on-off. There's a pressure sensor right here that cuts power at 4 bar. And then when you start spraying, pressure drops to 3 bar, and it starts back up again. This is totally seamless and really important. You really want this feature if you're buying an older model and it looks like this with no tank. In my experience, these are great compressors, but they do get really hot and they generate a lot of water. If it looks like this and it has that like low 23 LPM rating, it's the same. The TimberTech is the cheapest right now. Some of the new ones have improved cooling, but yeah, they're basically the same. This is basically identical to the previous compressor, just with a 3-liter tank. It's the same power, same airflow, same pressure cutoffs. So you turn it on, let it charge up, and then when you spray, you're just using the air in the tank. This means it's not a matter of if you can generate the right PSI for your airbrush, it's how long you can hold that pressure. And the moisture in the compressed air is condensing in the tank, which is great. But now, after every session, you want to turn it off, blow off most of the air down to like 15 PSI, and then slowly open the drain valve, pointing it down to prevent rust. I generally leave mine open when I'm not using it. Another thing is the safety valve, which opens if the pressure switch fails and doesn't turn off the pump. Generally speaking, you don't ever have to touch this. So just like the TC40, there's a ton of alternatives, but the Tooty comes in at $100. So if you decide to spend more than $100, this opens up an entire world of general use quiet compressors. This is the Fortress Ultra Quiet 1 gallon. It has almost double the power and a slightly larger tank that operates at significantly higher pressures. So you get 2 pistons instead of 1, a 1/4" quick disconnect instead of the 1/8" airbrush fitting. This has a lot more utility around the house, but you will need a different hose or an adapter for the airbrush. The drain valve is now much easier to use. The on-off switch is a lever, and we have a tank gauge, so you know exactly how much air you have in the tank. This tank layout, motor side by side, is noticeably quieter. And when we get into the testing, just know that the 2-gallon version is basically just double the numbers. So if you're deciding between those and the 1060 SP and the 2010A, I think the Fortress 2-gallon is going to be the way to go. Now, still under $200, you can get a full 1 horsepower motor and a 4.7-gallon tank, maybe even an 8-gallon tank on sale. So compared to the Tooty, this has about 6 times the power and about 10 times the air. Compared to the Fortress 1 gallon, this is double the power, 4 times the air. So it operates at slightly lower pressures than the Fortress, but you know, you can keep playing this game of like doubling your money. In my opinion, even this one, and generally past the 1 horsepower mark, they tend to stop being quiet. So now we're getting into the more unique stuff. This is an oiled silent compressor. It's very similar to what's in your refrigerator. These are all made by Werther, but sold here through Silent Air. This is the mid-range 1/3 horsepower unit, basically the same as the current DR300 model or the TC30 model. Very capable, extremely quiet, very expensive, and finicky. These can spit oil. They take special oil. They need oil changes. They don't like to be moved a lot, and they have a strict duty cycle because there's no ventilation. So 15 minutes on, 15 minutes off. If you're curious, the motor spins vertically and the piston goes sideways. This was 220 used and it's like 20 years old. So, you know, as soon as I finished my testing, it This is again a completely different type of compressor. So it uses a big electromagnet to pull a piston back and forth against a spring. And it's not really a piston, it's more like a rod. No motor and basically just one moving part. Unlike the others, these are designed to run 24/7. There's no pressure cutoffs, it just runs, but it still gets really hot. So you get a ton of moisture with this thing. Very reliable, still needs frequent breaks. This is the only compressor line that's as quiet as the Silent Air without all of the hassle of the oil. I got this in 2020. I used it like crazy. I mean, tons of props, countless late nights. They just came out with the L10. I wouldn't get the L5. I wouldn't get the other ones. You'll see it's really underpowered. Here's another option that's even smaller. I got this primarily to do touch-ups while I'm traveling. I also use it to clean things. If you're only doing really small model kits and minis, these are great. Also really nice to have as like a secondary. Just know it has some big flaws, like significantly reduced airflow when the battery is at 50%, just like a drill. It actually works exceptionally well with certain airbrushes, particularly the PS275 if you're trying to get like coverage on a model kit. But this is really not a good first option for props. I know this is really important for a lot of people, especially for me. Here's the noise test. Approximately 3 feet away with the NIOSH app and a cheap decibel meter. Recordings are done with the Zoom H5, set to level 8, no filters, no edits. So 4710SQ is too loud for an apartment. Perfect for a garage. All of these higher pressure compressors have a blow-off valve to release pressure on the motor so it can start back up again. You can DIY a muffler for this, but depends on the model. The 480-2 is about as good as it gets. This one is 20 years old. It has low oil, so a newer one will be quieter. It sounds exactly like a refrigerator. The Tooty, it's disappointingly loud for its size. Honestly, it's not that bad. You don't have the blow-off noise. The TC40 is significantly quieter despite being like the same exact motor. It gets noticeably louder as it builds up pressure. So this one, kind of annoying at night. The L7 sounds exactly like a buzz cutter. This is as good as it gets. The cordless, it's a little annoying at night, but otherwise just fine. Fortress 1 gallon, not bad at all. Really more like a wall-mounted AC unit. It's got that lower rumble to it. So now you can build an enclosure for any of these. Just make sure you're getting really good ventilation. So this one is on the simpler side with basically no baffles, and its main purpose is to provide massive cooling. This is a 3/4 plywood single wall. Depending on the design, you can expect somewhere between 10 and 15 decibels reduction. Foam will get you another like 2 to 3 decibels. When I put the TC40 in here, it's basically silent. If I put the L7 in here, I can't even tell if it's on. So the dB rating jumped by 5 in that last test, which is why I showed it again. And even though I'm using the same instruments in the same space, minor changes in the environment have a big effect on the sound. So also that XY mic on the H5 is extremely sensitive. So the whole point of this is to determine what guns we can use with each compressor. So I came up with 4 airbrushes in 6 configurations. Each one of them uses more air and more paint than the next. And this is really more about getting coverage on, hard plastics on props. First up is the Iwata HPCR, just a fantastic general purpose airbrush. 0.5 nozzle, great for details. Even the tiny compressors should be fine with this. Next is my personal favorite, the GSI Creos PS290. This is like the coverage king when you don't have a lot of air. It has a round cap like a normal airbrush, and it also has a fan cap which uses additional holes to shape the flow of paint into like a fan. So these fan caps get a bad rep because you can't adjust airflow to the fan. You have to rely on overall pressure and paint consistency. In my opinion, when you have a small compressor and a small booth, these are really, really good. But to use them, you really want more pressure range than you might have with a tankless compressor. Then we have the PS290's unofficial big brother, the TH2. Very similar overall design with a bigger air cap and a 0.6 nozzle. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but this uses like double the paint and double the air. Last is the LPH80, which is not an airbrush, but it's like the spot repair gun. It's the official Cerakote gun, super popular in a bunch of fields. It's always coming up. You're supposed to give it 13 PSI through a 1/4 inch hose because it needs around 2 CFM. Standard airbrush hose is going to restrict airflow. But I put it in this list because if you do this a lot, you're going to hear about the LPH80 a bunch, and you're going to want to try it. So let's start with the tankless compressors. You can only use as much air as these can squeeze in real time. So these are measured by the maximum pressure they can deliver to your airbrush. So the NoName 2024 cordless can only hold like 10 to 15 PSI with my smaller airbrushes. I had to have a regulator in between these, so that's going to eat up some of the pressure, but when I do break out the HPCR for details, I like it below the recommended range, right around like 10 to 15 PSI. So for that use case, it's actually quite good. Just don't expect too much from this in terms of coverage. Now, the L7 was actually bundled with the PS290, and they do work well together, just depending on the paint. It's a real struggle to use this combination with Createx Wicked without over-thinning. But it works well with Mr. Color, especially if you're using Mr. Color thinner in that like 1 to 1.5 ratio. You get decent performance with general purpose airbrushes, but once you get into the fan caps, you really want more pressure to adjust your pattern. TC40 is a big improvement over the L7, and it works really well with my Createx paints and the round caps. Still can't really make the best of the fan caps, but again, this performs really well with basically all of my general purpose airbrushes, and is giving you the full range of recommended pressures for those general purpose, like the 0.5 HPCR. Now, the compressors with a tank are measured by how long they can run each of these airbrushes at their recommended maximum and minimum pressures. You can still get pressure drops if you're just blasting while the compressor is also trying to fill the tank. I try to ease up when the compressor is cycling, so the NoName Tooty has a pretty big performance boost. With the PS290 fan cap and the TH2 round, it's going to be working pretty hard. With the TH2 and the fan cap, you're pretty limited to just spraying a little bit and then waiting and then spraying a little bit and then waiting. So the Fortress 1 gallon and the Badger 480 are really similar in performance, and you can expect solid performance across basically all airbrushes and most miniguns. LPH80 will pretty much suck the life out of these things. You can only do like little bursts, and it's not really viable. And lastly is the 4710SQ, which it's going to be off most of the time you're spraying. So if I'm spraying with the HPCR, it might cycle every 10 minutes. On the other hand, Iwata recommends a 2 horsepower motor for the LPH80. I have the smaller air cap, but for a prop making workflow, this would be totally fine. So this testing has a lot of room for error. I tried to use the same regulator and the shortest possible hoses pretty much wherever possible. Just know this is like a general idea of what to expect when it comes to runtimes and pressures. The color coding is my opinion, and this is mostly a reference when you're going for coverage. So if you're just starting out, the Tooty and the TC40 are incredible options. If you're doing minis and Gunpla stuff, pretty much anything works. You might even be happier with a cordless option. You just fits in a drawer, throw it in your bag. If you're mostly doing props and cosplay stuff or bigger 3D prints, I really think the Fortress Ultra Quiet line is the way to go, especially the 2-gallon version with the aluminum tank. That's the one to get. If you have a nice place to spray, maybe like a garage or a yard, you could even go bigger and start messing around with the HVLP stuff. If you're like me and you have that degen sleep schedule and or noise is a big concern, I mean, the L7 had a lot of value for me because noise never prevented me from painting. Knowing what I know now, and like if I could go back in time, I would buy the DR500s from Silent Air brand new. Yes, it's expensive. It's not good for beginners. I know it's finicky, but it would have saved me a lot of money and countless midnight hours. And you hear about these things lasting like 30 years. Out of all of the higher power airbrush specific compressors, the only one I'm really interested in is the super cool Tooty OS. It has active cooling and a lot of power. You may never want to run something like the TH2. For me, it was a huge upgrade, completely changed how I paint things. Just know it's going to burn through these like super fast, and it's probably going to overwhelm one of these booths. A baby spray gun is basically double that. You absolutely do not need the insane amount of equipment that I just mentioned. I painted the Sova Bow and the Reaver Op outside with an L7 and a 0.4 single action. It kind of sucked. You know, it took forever. It's a lot harder to get smooth, even coverage with those guns, but you can always fall back on spray paint. If you're doing this a lot and, you know, maybe you start having real deadlines on your work, then you're going to want more air. You're going to want bigger guns. And yeah, these are the options. You heard what they sound like. You know what you can get out of them. I hope this helps. And the next video is all about rebuilding that Badger.